at 6:30.
Contact center force. I see the
On
main
October
fleet
25,
bearing
1944,
040, approximately
Ensign William
30
Brooks
miles.
was flying routine anti-submarine patrol from the escort carrier USS Sancta
Low
when he spotted something on the horizon that made his blood freeze. Pagoda masts, the distinctive superstructures of Japanese battleships emerging from the morning haze, TDing 17 miles to the northwest. Brooks blinked, looked again.
Fueling complete on the Avenger.
It had to be
Roger.
a mistake.
Let's get this panel
there
secured
they
before
were.
chow.
4 battleships,
6, maybe 8 cruisers.
destroyers everywhere.
battle stations on the
A massive Japanese surface fleet where no Japanese fleet should be. He radioed back to his carrier. He was looking at a major Japanese force bearing down on him.
Nobody believed him.
It was impossible.
Nobody believed him.
On the bridge
It
of
was
the escort
impossible.
carrier, USS Fanshawe
On the bridge
Bay,
of the escort
flagship
carrier,
of Task
USS
Unit 77,
Bay.
flagship of
4,
Task Unit 77,
3, 4, 3,
known
4,
by its radio call sign as
3,
Taffy, known
3.
by its radio call sign as
Rear
Taffy.
Admiral Clifton
3.
Sprague demanded confirmation.
Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague
Japanese
demanded
battleships couldn't
confirmation.
be here. Japanese
Admiral
battleships
William
couldn't be
Hoel's
here.
mighty Third Fleet,
Admiral William
with its
Hoel's
fast battleships
mighty
and
Third
fleet
Fleet,
carriers, with its
was
fast
supposed to be
battleships
guarding
and
San
fleet
Bernardino
carriers,
straight to the
was
north.
supposed to be guarding San Bernardino
Admiral Jesse
straight to the
Oldenburg,
north. 7th Fleet battleships
Admiral Jesse
had just
Oldenburg,
annihilated
7th
the Japanese
Fleet
Southern
battleships
force
had
had just
Suriga Strait
annihilated a
hours
Japanese
earlier.
Southern force at Suriga Strait.
Taffy 3 was
hours
in the
earlier.
safe zone.
60 mi
Taffy
east
3
of
was in the
Samar
safe
Island.
zone.
60
Launching
mi
routine
east
ground
of Samar
support
Island
missions
for the troops
launching
on Lee.
routine ground
Hunting
support
submarines
missions
for the troops on Lee.
This was
Hunting
supposed to be
submarines.
milk run duty. This was supposed
Brooks
to be
wasn't
milk run
seeing
duty.
things. But
Coming
Brooks
through
wasn't
the morning
seeing
mist
things. At 27 knots,
Coming through the
was
morning
Vice
mist
Admiral
at
Teo
27
Kurita's
knots.
center force.
Was Vice
the
Admiral
most powerful
Teo
surface
Kurita's
fleet
center
Japan
force.
had assembled
The most
since
powerful
the Battle of
surface
Midway.
fleet
Japan had assembled
4
since the
battleships.
Battle of Midway.
Yamato,
Nagato,
4
Kongo,
battleships.
and Haruna.
Yamato,
Nagato,
6 heavy
Kongo,
cruisers.
and Haruna.
Chikuma,
Tona,
6 heavy
Chokai,
cruisers.
Kumano,
Chikuma,
Suzuya,
Tona,
and Haguro. Chokai, Kumano,
2
Suzuya,
light cruisers.
and Haguro.
Yahagi and Noshiro. 2 light cruisers. 11
Yahagi
destroyers.
and Noshiro.
Over 200,000 tons 11 of warships.
destroyers.
Over 200,000
Leading them was
tons of
Yamato
warships.
herself.
Leading them was
72,000
Yamato
tons.
herself.
The largest battleship ever
72,000
built.
tons.
The largest
Her main
battleship
battery
ever
consisted
built.
of 918.
Her main battery
One in
consisted of
guns.
918.
The largest naval artillery
One
ever
in
put
guns.
to sea.
The largest naval artillery
Each gun
ever
could
put
fire
to
a
sea.
300-ton shell.
Each
over
gun could
25
fire a
meter.
300-ton
She carried
shell
over
over
125 millimeter anti-aircraft.
She carried
guns.
over 125
Her armor
anti-aircraft
belt was
guns.
16 and thick. Her armor belt
She
was
was designed to
16
fight
thick.
and destroy any ship in the world.
She was designed to fight and destroy
she was
any
heading
ship in the
straight
world.
for 6 escort carriers.
And she
that
was
were
heading
never meant
straight
to
for
fight
6
anything
escort
bigger than a
carriers.
submarine. That were never meant to fight anything
Kurita's
bigger
force
than a
had
submarine.
slipped through San Bernardino.
Kurita's
Straight in
force had
complete
slipped
darkness
through
at
San
3
Bernardino.
Aquade.
Straight in complete darkness at 3 Aquade.
Undetected and unopposed. The
Undetected
Japanese
and
admiral
unopposed.
couldn't believe his luck. The Japanese admiral
He had
couldn't
expected
believe
to
his
find the
luck.
strait blocked by American
He had
battleships.
expected to find the strait blocked by
Instead,
American
it
battleships.
was empty.
Instead,
Holy had taken
it
the
was
bait.
empty.
Racing north with
Holy
his
had
entire
taken the
force
bait.
to attack Admiral
Racing north
Ozawa's
with his
decoy
entire
carriers.
force to attack
leaving
Admiral
the back door
Ozawa's
to
decoy
Leyte
carriers.
wide open. Leaving the back door to
Now
Leyte Gulf
Kurita was
wide
bearing
open.
down on the invasion beaches.
Now
Where
Kurita was bearing down on the
130,000
invasion
American
beaches,
soldiers
where
depended on
130,000
naval support for
American
survival.
soldiers depended on naval
Standing
support
between
for
this
survival.
armada and total disaster.
Standing between
were
this
ships of
armada
Taffy
and
3.
total disaster were
6
the ships
escort
of Taffy
carriers.
3, USS Fanshawe Bay,
6 escort
USS
carriers.
Saint, USS Fanshawe Bay,
Below.
USS Saint, USS White Plains,
Below.
USS Kalanan Bay,
USS White
USS
Plains,
Kitchen Bay,
USS
and
Kalanan
USS
Bay,
Gambia Bay,
USS Kitchen Bay,
3
USS
Fletcher class
Gambia Bay.
destroyer, USS Johnston,
3 Fletcher class
USS
destroyer,
Heermann,
USS
USS
Heermann.
Johnston, USS Hugh,
4 destroyer
USS
escorts.
Heermann,
USS Samuel
4
B.
destroyer escorts,
Robert,
USS Samuel
USS
B.
Dennis,
USS John
Roberts,
C., USS Dennis,
Butler,
USS John
USS
C.
Raymond. Butler.
The carriers were
USS
Kaiser-built Casablanca class
The
ships.
carriers were
constructed
Kaiser-built
in shipyards
Casablanca class
that normally
ships,
made cargo
constructed
vessels.
in
shipyards that normally
They were
made
converted
cargo
merchant
vessels.
hulls with flight decks
They were
bolted on
converted
top.
merchant hulls with flight
Top
decks
speed
bolted
18
on top.
knots on a good day.
About
Top
as fast
speed
as a
18
loaded
knots
oil
on a
tanker.
good day.
About as fast
Their
as a
flight
loaded
decks
oil
were
tanker.
wooden planks over thin steel.
Their flight decks were wooden
Their
planks
hulls
over
had no
thin
armor
steel.
worth mentioning.
Their hulls had
5
no
in
armor
guns,
worth mentioning.
1 per ship.
For
5 in
anti-aircraft
guns,
defense.
1 per ship.
For
They were never
anti-aircraft
meant to fight
defense.
surface ships. They were never meant
They were
to
floating
fight surface
airfields
ships.
designed to provide air cover
They were
for
floating
convoys
airfields
and
designed to
amphibious
provide
landings.
air cover for convoys.
Each
and
carrier had
amphibious
about
landings.
30 aircraft.
Each carrier had about
Wildcat
30
fighters,
aircraft.
and
FM2
TBM,
Wildcat
Avenger
torpedo
fighters,
bombers.
and TBM,
But most were
Avenger
configured for
torpedo
ground
bombers.
support.
But most were
Armed with
configured for
rockets,
ground support.
small bombs,
Depth
armed
charges.
with rockets,
Maybe
small
a dozen
bombs,
torpedoes
depth
total
charges.
among all 6
Maybe a
carriers'
dozen
air groups.
torpedoes total
Not nearly
among
enough
all
to
6
stop a
carriers'
battlefield.
air groups.
Not nearly
The
enough to
destroyers
stop a
were the
battlefield.
carrier's only real protection. The destroyers were the carrier's
USS
only real
Johnston, protection. USS Hull, USS Johnston,
Herman,
USS
Fletcher-class
Hull,
destroyers,
and USS Heermann,
2,500
Fletcher-class destroyers,
5 dual-purpose,
2,500
5 in
tons,
guns,
5
10
dual
torpedo
purpose,
tubes,
5 in guns.
They were
10
fast.
torpedo tubes,
38 knots at flank
They
speed.
were fast,
but they were built
38
for
knots
escort
at flank
duty.
speed.
Not slugging
They were
matches
built
with
for escort
battleships.
duty.
Not slugging
Their
matches
armor
with
was measured in
battleships.
fractions of inches.
Their
Just
armor
enough
was
to keep
measured
out
in
fractions
splinters.
of inches. Just
The
enough to
destroyer
keep out
escorts were
splinters.
even smaller.
The destroyer
USS
escorts were even
Samuel B.
smaller. Roberts,
USS Samuel
USS
B.
Dennis, USS
Roberts,
Johnston, USS Dennis,
Butler,
USS
and
Johnston,
USS
Raymond were John
Butler,
and USS
Butler
Raymond
class.
were John C. 1 700 tons,
Butler
two
class.
Fianbon guns,
1 700
3
tons.
torpedo tubes, 2 Fianbon guns.
They were
three
submarine
torpedo
hunters
tubes that had never trained.
They
for
were
surface
submarine
combat.
hunters
that had never
Their
trained
crews
for surface
called them
combat.
tin cans
because the
Their
hulls were
crews
so
called
thin
them tin
that
cans
near misses
because
from
the
large
hulls were
caliber
so thin
shells could
that
cave
near
them in
misses
from
from
large
water
caliber
pressure
shells could cave them in.
The
from
mathematics
water
were
pressure
hopeless.
The
The
American
American
force
force
had
had
guns that fired 54
The American
low shells
force had
to a
guns that
maximum
fired
range of
54
10 low shells.
The Japanese had guns that fired
shells weighing
The
over
Japanese
3,000
had guns
pondsticks
that
to
fired
ranges
shells
exceeding
weighing over
25,000 pondsticks to
The
ranges
Americans had
exceeding
about
25
24 torpedoes total.
The Americans had about 24
The Japanese had
torpedoes
over
total.
100.
The
The American
Japanese
carriers
had
could
over
make 18 knots running for
The
their
American
lives.
carriers could make 18
The
knots running
Japanese
for their
ships could
lives.
make 30 knots chasing them.
The Japanese ships could make
It
30
wasn't a
knots
battle.
chasing them. It was an
It wasn't a
execution
battle.
waiting to happen. It was an
At
execution waiting
6:45,
to happen. Lookouts on the escort
At
carriers
6:45,
saw anti-aircraft
lookouts
bursts
on
to
the
north.
escort carriers saw anti-aircraft
Japanese float
bursts to the
planes were
north.
already overhead.
Japanese
Spotting for
float
the
planes
incoming
were
fleet.
already overhead.
Spotting
Admiral
for the
Sprague
incoming
ordered
fleet.
all ships to general quarters.
Admiral Sprague
ordered
all
all
ships
ships
to
to
general
the east
quarters and told
ordered
all
a course
carriers
change
to
to
launch
the
every
east
aircraft that
and
could
told
fly.
all carriers to
armed or
launch
not,
every aircraft
get them
that
in
could
the air.
fly.
Armed or not,
At 68,
get them in the
the
air.
northern horizon erupted
At
in flame.
68, the northern horizon
The Japanese
erupted
battle
in
line
flame.
had opened fire.
The Japanese battle
The
line
first
had
salvos
opened
were
fire.
from Yamato's 18-in
The
guns.
first salvos were from Yamato's
Each shell weighed
18-in
as much as a
guns.
small car.
Each shell weighed
They
as
were
much as a
armor
small
piercing,
car, designed to punch through
They
the
were
30-in
armor
armor
piercing,
belts of
designed
American
to punch
battleships.
through the 30-in armor belts
Against
of
the
American
unarmored
battleships.
escort carriers.
Against
would
the
pass clean
unarmored
through without
escort
exploding,
carriers.
unless
would
they
pass
hit something
clean through
without
substantial.
exploding. Unless they
But
hit
if they
something
did explode
substantial
inside the ship,
one
But
shell
if they
could tear
did
a carrier
explode
inside
half,
the ship. One shell could
the
tear a
Japanese
carrier
ships
in
used
half.
colored dye markers in their
The
shells.
Japanese ships used colored
Red
dye
from
markers in their
Yamato,
shells.
yellow from Nagato,
Red from
green
Yamato,
Haruna,
yellow
blue
from
from
Nagato,
Congo,
green from Haruna.
different
blue
colors
from
for
Congo.
the cruisers.
It
Different
helped
colors for
spotters
the cruisers.
identify which ship's shells were
It
landing
helped
where.
spotters identify which
The
ship's
sea
shells were
around
landing
Taffy
where.
3 erupted in colored
The sea
water
around
spouts,
Taffy
200
3
feet
erupted
tall.
in colored water spouts.
It was
200
beautiful and
feet tall.
terrifying. It was
On the
beautiful
bridge of
and
the escort
terrifying.
carrier.
On the bridge of
planes.
the escort
Captain
carrier.
Dennis Sullivan
White
watched the
planes.
colored geysers
Captain
march
Dennis
toward his
Sullivan
ship.
watched
Red,
the colored geysers
yellow,
march
green,
toward his ship,
walking
red,
closer with
yellow,
each salvo.
green,
Walking
He
closer
ordered his
with each
helmsman
salvo.
to steer toward the last splash.
He ordered his helmsman to
The
steer
theory
toward
was
the
the
last
Japanese
splash.
wouldn't fire twice at the
The
same
theory
spot.
was the Japanese wouldn't fire
It was
twice
all
at
they
the
had.
same spot.
Admiral
It was all
Sprague
they
knew his
had.
carriers couldn't outrun the Japanese.
Admiral Sprague knew his carriers
He
couldn't
ordered
outrun
them
the
to turn
Japanese.
southeast toward a rain
He
squall on
ordered
the
them to
horizon.
turn southeast toward a
Ordered
rain squall
all
on the
escorts to
horizon.
make smoke and sent
Ordered
out a plain
all
language
escorts to make
distress
smoke
call
that would
and sent
become
out
famous.
a plain language distress call.
Enemy
that would
surface
become
force
famous.
of 4 battleships.
7
Enemy surface
cruisers,
force of 4
11
battleships.
destroyers,
7
20
cruisers,
m northwest
11
of this unit,
destroyers,
and
closing.
20 m northwest of this unit.
Request immediate
and closing.
assistance on the bridge of the destroyer.
Request immediate
USS
assistance
Johnston.
on the bridge of the destroyer.
Commander
USS
Ernest Edwin
Johnston.
Evans didn't wait for orders.
Commander Ernest Edwin
Evans was
didn't wait for
36 years
orders.
old.
Cherokee and
Evans
Creek
was
from Horn,
36 years
Oklahoma.
old.
Cherokee and Creek
He was
from
one of
Horn,
the first
Oklahoma.
Native Americans to graduate from
He
the
was
Naval
one of the
Academy.
first Native Americans
Class of
to graduate from the
1931.
Naval Academy and the first to
Class of
command a
1931.
and the first
When he
to command
commissioned
a Johnston
destroyer.
a year earlier at Seattle.
When he
He
commissioned
gathered
Johnston
his crew
a year
and told
earlier
them.
at Seattle.
This
He
is going
gathered
to be
his
a
crew
fighting
and
ship.
told them,
This
I
is
intend
going
to
to be
go
a
in
fighting
harm's
ship.
way.
And anyone who
I
doesn't want to
intend to
go
go in
along
harm's way.
had better get off
And
right
anyone
now.
who doesn't want to go along,
Nobody
get
got
off
off
right now.
Now without
Nobody
waiting
got
for the
off.
order to attack.
Now
Evans
without
commanded
waiting
all
for the
ahead
order to
flank
attack.
full left rudder. Evans commanded all ahead
USS
flank full
Johnston,
left rudder.
2,200 tons.
USS
was turning
Johnston,
toward 4 battleships.
2,200 tons,
displacing
was
over
turning toward
200,000
4
tons combined.
displacing over 200,000
One
tons
destroyer against
combined.
the might of the Imperial Japanese
One
Navy.
destroyer against the might of the
was
Imperial
suicide.
Japanese Navy. But Evans
It was
understood
suicide.
something the mathematics didn't capture.
But Evans understood something the
Every minute
mathematics
the
didn't
Japanese
capture.
spent dealing with his ship.
Every
was
minute
a minute
the
the
Japanese
carriers
spent
could
dealing
run.
with his ship.
Was a minute
Every
the
shell
carriers
fired
could
at
run.
Johnston
Was a shell not fired
Every
at
shell
the carriers
fired at
with their
Johnston
900
was a
man
shell
crews.
not fired at the carriers with their
And in the
900
rain,
man crews.
squalls and smoke that were
And in the
beginning
rain,
to obscure the
squalls
battlefield.
and smoke
that were were beginning
Aggressive
to obscure
action
the
might
battlefield.
create confusion. Aggressive action
At
might
7:10,
create confusion.
Johnston was making smoke.
At 7:10,
laying a thick black
Johnston
screen
was
between
making
the
smoke,
Japanese and the
laying
carriers.
a thick black screen between the
Her
Japanese
5 and
and the
guns
carriers.
were firing at maximum
Her
rate.
5 and
at the
guns
heavy cruiser
were firing
Kumano.
at maximum
The
rate.
closest
at the
Japanese
heavy
ship
cruiser
at
Kumano.
14,000
The closest
run slot.
Japanese ship at
The
14,000
5-inch shells
run
couldn't
slot.
penetrate Kumano's 8
The
in
5
armor
inch
belt,
shells couldn't
but they
penetrate
could wreck her
Kumano's 8 in
superstructure,
armor belt,
destroy her
but they
fire
could wreck
control,
her superstructure,
kill exposed
destroy
crew,
her fire control.
Johnston
Exposed
zigzagged
crew.
toward the Japanese fleet.
Johnston
chasing shell
zigzagged
splashes
toward the Japanese
using
fleet,
smoke for
chasing
concealment.
shell splashes.
At
using
10,000
smoke for
yards
concealment.
maximum torpedo range. At
Evans
10,000
launched
yards
his
maximum
10
torpedo
15
range.
torpedoes at
Evans
Kumano.
launched his 10
then
Mark
kept
15
closing,
torpedoes
kept
at
firing,
Kumano.
then kept closing.
The 5 and guns
kept
were
firing.
firing so fast, the
The
paint
5
was
and
burning
guns
off
were
the
firing
barrels.
so fast, the paint
In
was
few
burning
minutes,
off the barrels.
Johnston pumped over 200
In few
shells
minutes,
into the heavy
Johnston
cruiser.
pumped over 200
At
shells into the
7:24,
heavy cruiser.
Kumano seemed to explode. At 7:24,
Multiple
Kumano seemed to
torpedo
explode.
hits.
Either 1 or 3.
Multiple
depending
torpedo
on the source.
hits.
Either
Blew her
1
bow
or 3,
completely
depending
off.
on the source.
Blew
She
her
sheared
bow
out of
completely
formation.
off.
Crippled.
Taking
She sheared
the
out
heavy
of
cruiser
formation.
Suzuki with her
Crippled.
as an escort.
Taking the heavy cruiser Suzuki
In his first
with her as
attack,
an escort. Evans had removed 2
In his
heavy
first
cruisers
attack,
from the battle. Evans had removed 2
But
heavy
now,
cruisers
Johnston
from the
was
battle.
alone.
7,000
now,
yards from
Johnston
the Japanese
was
battle
alone.
line. 7,000 yards from
She'd
the
been
Japanese
spotted.
battle line.
The battleship
She'd been
Yamato
spotted.
opened fire with her secondary
The battleship
battery of
Yamato
6
opened
guns.
fire with her secondary battery
3
of
shells
6
hit
guns.
simultaneously. 3
The
shells hit
impacts were
simultaneously.
catastrophic. The
One shell
impacts were
destroyed the
catastrophic.
after engine room.
Cutting
One shell
Johnston's
destroyed
speed in
the
half.
after engine room.
Cutting
Another
Johnston's
wrecked
speed
the
in
after
half.
5 and gun mount. Another wrecked
The
the
third
after
hit the
5 and gun
bridge.
mount.
Commander
The
Evans
third
was
hit the
torn
bridge.
apart. Commander
2
Evans
fingers
of
of
his
his
left
left
hand
apart.
were blown off. 2 fingers of his
His
left
shirt was
hand were
burned
blown
completely
off.
away.
His shirt was
Shrapnel
burned
wounds
completely
covered
away.
his neck, chest, and legs.
Shrapnel wounds covered his neck,
Blood
chest,
streamed down
and
his
legs.
body.
Blood
His
streamed
communications
down his
officer
body.
and several others were killed
His
instantly.
communications officer and several
But
others
Evans
were killed
stayed at his
instantly.
post.
Wrapping his shirt
But
around
Evans
his
stayed
wounded
at his
hand.
post,
Continuing
wrapping
to
his
con
shirt
his
around
ship.
his wounded hand.
More
Continuing
shells
to con
followed.
his ship.
14
More
in
shells
shells
from
from
the
the
battleship Congo.
14 in shells
8
from
in
the
shells
battleship
from multiple
Congo.
cruisers. 8 in shells
They
from
tore through
multiple
Johnston
cruisers.
like she was made of tissue paper.
They tore through Johnston like
The
she was
forward
made of
engine
tissue
room
paper.
was destroyed.
The forward engine
Electrical
room
power
was destroyed.
failed. The
Electrical
gyro compass
power
tumbled.
failed.
Steering
gyro
control was
compass
lost
tumbled.
from the bridge. Steering
But
control was
somehow
lost from the
Johnston
bridge.
stayed afloat. Stayed in
But
the
somehow
fight.
Johnston stayed afloat.
Evans shifted
Stayed in
steering
the fight.
control to the after steering compartment.
Evans shifted steering
shouting
control
orders
to the
through an
after
open
steering
hatch,
compartment
while men manually
shouting
turned
orders
the rudder.
through an open hatch. While
Back
men
on the
manually
carriers,
turned the rudder.
pilots were launching in anything
Back on the
that could fly.
carriers, pilots were launching
Many
in
of the
anything that
Avengers
could
hadn't
fly.
been loaded with torpedoes.
Many of the Avengers hadn't
They were
been loaded with
configured for ground
torpedoes.
support.
With 100
They were
pound
configured for ground
bombs,
support.
rockets,
100-pound
even
general
depth
purpose
charges.
bombs.
Rockets.
The Wildcats
even
had
depth
only their
charges.
50 caliber machine guns.
The Wildcats had only their 50
but they took
caliber
off
machine
anyway,
guns,
forming up.
heading
But they
for
took
the
off
Japanese
anyway,
fleet.
forming up.
At
Heading for the
7:16,
Japanese fleet.
Admiral Sprague gave the
At
order every
7:16,
destroyer captain
Admiral
had been waiting
Sprague
for.
gave the order every destroyer
Small
captain
boys
had been
attack.
waiting for.
Launch
Small
torpedo
boys
attack.
attack. The little
Launch
ships were
torpedo
going
attack.
in on the destroyer USS
The little
Hull.
ships were going in on the destroyer
Commander Leon
USS
Kintberger
Hull.
ordered flank speed. Commander Leon
Hull
Kintberger
had been the
ordered flank
flagship
speed.
of the destroyer screen.
Hull
But
had
her
been the
talk between
flagship
ships
of the
radio
destroyer
was
screen.
malfunctioning.
But her talk
So
between
tactical
ships radio
command had
was
passed to
malfunctioning.
Johnston. So tactical
Now
command had
charged
passed
toward
to
the nearest
Johnston.
battleship.
Congo.
Now charged toward the nearest
18,000
battleship.
wide away.
Congo.
35 knots through a
18,000
hurricane
wide
of
away.
steel. 35 knots
Japanese
through a
shells
hurricane of
walked
steel.
up Hull's wake.
Each
Japanese
salvo
shells
closer
walked
than the
up
last.
Hull's wake.
Each salvo
Red dye
closer
from
than the
Yamato.
last. Green from Haruna.
Red dye from
Blue from
Yamato.
Congo.
Green from Haruna.
The columns
Blue
of
from
water
Congo.
towered over the destroyer's bridge.
The columns of water towered
At
over the destroyer's
14,000
bridge.
miles. Still at extreme
At 14,000
range.
miles.
Kintberger launched
Still
half
at
his
extreme
torpedoes
range.
at Congo.
Kintberger launched half
The
his
battleship
torpedoes
saw
at
them
Congo.
coming.
Turned away.
The battleship saw them
All
coming.
5 torpedoes
Turned
missed.
away.
All
Hell
5
kept closing.
torpedoes missed.
At 9,000
kept
baud,
closing.
she launched her remaining
9,000
5 torpedoes
baud,
at the heavy
she
cruiser
launched her
Haguro.
remaining 5
Then
torpedoes
opened fire
at the
with
heavy
her 5
cruiser
in
Haguro.
guns. Then opened fire
The
with her 5
torpedoes
in
missed
guns.
again.
But they forced Haguro
The torpedoes
to evade,
missed again,
disrupting
but they
her fire.
forced Haguro to evade.
Then the
disrupting
Japanese
her
found
fire.
Hull's range. Then the Japanese
Multiple
found
ships
Hull's
converged
range.
their fire on the destroyer.
Multiple ships converged their
16
fire
in
on the
shells from
destroyer.
Yamato.
14 in
16
shells
in
from
shells
Congo.
from Yamato.
8 in shells from
14 in
Haguro
shells
and
from
Tone.
Congo.
8 in shells from
They literally
Haguro
tore
and
Hull
Tone.
apart.
They
Her
literally
port
tore
engine
Hull
was
apart.
destroyed. Her
Her
port
rudder
engine was
jammed.
destroyed.
Her guns were
Her
knocked
rudder
out
jammed.
one by one. Her guns
She
were
was
knocked
flooding
out
from
one by
dozens
one.
of holes.
She was
In
flooding
40
from
minutes,
dozens of holes.
she took over 40 hits from
In
major
40
caliber
minutes,
shells.
she took over 40 hits from
But she
major
had
caliber
accomplished
shells.
her mission.
But she
She
had
had forced the
accomplished her
Japanese
mission.
to maneuver.
Disrupted
She had
their
forced the
formation.
Japanese to maneuver.
Bought precious minutes
Disrupted
for the
their
carriers
formation.
to escape into
Bought
a
precious
providential
minutes
rain
for the
squall
carriers
that was
to
moving
escape
across
into
the
a
battlefield.
providential rain squall that was
The
moving
destroyer,
across the battlefield.
USS Heermann,
Commanded
the
by
destroyer,
Commander Amos Hoel,
USS Heermann,
had started
commanded
the
by
battle
Commander
on the
Amos
disengaged
Hoel,
side of the
had
formation.
started the battle
The
on
side
the
away from the
disengaged side of the
Japanese.
formation. The side
Now
away
she
from the
raced at flank
Japanese.
speed through the American formation.
Now she
to get
raced at
into the
flank
fight.
speed through the American formation.
Visibility
to get
was
into
down
the
to a
fight.
few hundred yards in the smoke.
Visibility was down to a few hundred yards.
Heermann
in the
nearly
smoke and
collided
rain.
with the destroyer escort Samuel
Heermann
B.
nearly collided collided with the destroyer
Roberts,
escort Samuel
backing
B.
emergency full to avoid her.
Roberts, backing
Then
emergency
she
full
almost
to
hit.
avoid her.
It was controlled
Then she almost
chaos.
hit.
It
Ships
was controlled
maneuvering
chaos.
desperately in near zero visibility.
Ships maneuvering desperately.
Heermann
near zero
emerged from the
visibility.
smoke screen to find herself
Heermann
facing
emerged
four
from the smoke
Japanese
screen
battleships
to
to
find
find herself facing four Japanese
Congo
battleships
leading,
in column.
then Haruna,
then
Congo
Nagato,
leading,
then the
then
mighty
Haruna,
Yamato herself,
then Nagato, then the mighty
Commander
Yamato
Hathaway
herself.
didn't hesitate. Commander
He
Hathaway
ordered his
didn't
destroyer
hesitate.
straight at them. He ordered his
At
destroyer
10,000
straight at
Wau,
them.
Hathaway launched
At
3
10,000
torpedoes at
Wau,
Congo.
Hathaway launched 3
battleship
torpedoes at
evaded.
Congo. At
The battleship
4,400 from
evaded.
Leyte.
Suicidally close
4,400
to battleships
from
that could obliterate his ship
close to
with a single
battleships
salvo.
that could obliterate his
Hathaway
ship
launched
with a
3
single
more
salvo.
torpedoes at Haruna.
Hathaway launched 3
The
more
battleship
torpedoes at
emergency
Haruna.
turned to avoid them. The battleship emergency
Then Heermann
turned
fired
to
her
avoid
last torpedoes at Yamato.
Then Heermann fired her last
What happened
torpedoes
next
at Yamato.
changed the battle.
What happened
Yamato's
next
lookout
changed the
spotted
battle.
the torpedo wakes. Yamato's lookout
Admiral
spotted the
Kurita,
torpedo wakes.
who had transferred his flag to
Admiral
Yamato
Kurita,
after his
who had
original
transferred his
flagship
flag
was
to
sunk by
Yamato
American
after his
submarines
original
2 days
flagship
earlier,
was sunk by
ordered
American
the massive
submarines
battleship
2
to
days
turn north
earlier
to evade.
Ordered the massive battleship
But the
to turn north
torpedoes
to
kept
evade.
coming, and Yamato kept running.
But the torpedoes kept coming
For 10
and Yamato
critical
kept
minutes,
running.
the most powerful battleship
10
in the
critical
world,
minutes,
with the Japanese
the most
admiral
powerful
aboard,
battleship in the
was
world,
heading
with
away
the
from the
Japanese
battle.
admiral aboard.
By the
heading
time
away from
Kurita
the
got
battle.
Yamato turned around, by the time
engagement
Kurita
had
got
transformed
Yamato
into
turned
a
around,
confused melee.
the engagement had transformed
Meanwhile,
into a
the
confused
destroyer
melee.
escorts were attacking.
Meanwhile, the destroyer
On
escorts
USS
were
Samuel
attacking.
B. On
Roberts,
USS Samuel
Lieutenant
B.
Commander Robert Copeland had been listening to the
Lieutenant
radio
Commander
chatter.
Robert Copeland had been
He could
listening
hear
to
the
the radio
destroyers
chatter.
engaging. He could hear
Here,
the destroyers engaging.
Admiral Sprague ordering torpedo attacks.
Admiral Sprague ordering
Copeland was
torpedo
34
attacks.
years old from Tacoma, Washington.
Copeland was 34 years old.
His
from
ship was
Tacoma,
built to
Washington.
hunt submarines, not fight
His
battleships.
ship was built to hunt submarines.
But when
not
the order
fight
came for the
battleships.
destroyer escorts to attack,
But when the order came for the
Copeland
destroyer
grabbed the ship's
escorts to
intercom.
attack, Copeland
Men,
grabbed the
he
ship's
said,
intercom.
The enemy force is now
Men,
bearing
he said,
OD5s,
the
distance
enemy
7
force
force is now bearing
We're
OD5s,
going
distance 7 miles.
in.
This will be
We're
a fight
going
against
in.
overwhelming odds, from
This
which
will be a
survival
fight against
cannot be
overwhelming
expected.
odds.
From which survival
We will do
cannot
what
be
damage we
expected.
can. We will
The
do
crew
what
of
damage
Samuel
we can.
B. Roberts had
crew of
been at
Samuel
general
B.
quarters since before dawn.
Roberts had been at general
They
quarters
could see
since
the
before
colored shell
dawn.
splashes walking closer
They
to
could
the
see the
carriers.
colored shell splashes walking
They could
closer
hear the
to
rumble
carriers.
of heavy guns that sounded
They
like
could
freight
hear the
trains
rumble of
passing
heavy
overhead.
guns
That sounded like freight
They knew
trains
what
passing
Copeland was
overhead.
telling them. They knew
They
what
were going
Copeland
to
was
die,
telling them.
but they were going to die
They were
fighting.
going to die, but they were
Copeland
going to
ordered
die
all the
fighting.
head flank. Copeland
The
ordered
destroyer
all the
escorts
head flank.
engines designed for 24
The destroyer
knots
escorts
were pushed
engines
past their
designed for
limits.
24 knots. were
Chief
pushed past
Engineer
their
Lieutenant
limits.
Robert Trowbridge,
Chief
somehow got
Engineer
28
Lieutenant
knots out
Robert
of them.
Trowbridge
Somehow got
The entire
28
ship
knots out of them.
vibrated like it would shake apart.
The entire ship vibrated
The deck
like it would
plates
shake
flexed.
apart.
The
The
engine
deck plates
screamed.
flexed. But
The
Samuel
engine
B.
screamed. Roberts charged toward the
Samuel B.
Japanese fleet. Roberts charged toward the
4,000
Japanese
often
fleet.
from the heavy cruiser Chokai.
At 4,000
Impossibly
from the
close
heavy
range.
cruiser Chokai.
Roberts launched her 3
Impossibly
Mark
close
15
range.
torpedoes.
Roberts launched her 3 Mark
Then she
15
opened fire with her
torpedoes.
2 5-in guns.
Then she opened fire with
the
her 2
first salvo
5-in
missed.
guns. The
The
second
first
hit,
salvo
then
missed.
another,
and another.
The second hit,
The
then
little
another,
destroyer
and another.
escort was pumping
The
armor-piercing
little
shells
destroyer
into a heavy
escort
cruiser
was pumping
at
armor-piercing
point-blank range.
shells into a heavy cruiser.
The
at
Japanese
point-blank
returned
range.
fire. The
8 in
Japanese
shells from
returned
Chokai,
fire.
14 in shells
8
from
in shells
Congo.
from Chokai.
14
But at
in
such
shells
close
from
range,
Congo.
the Japanese ships
But at
couldn't
such
depress
close
their
range,
guns enough to
the
hit
Japanese
the tiny
ships
destroyer
couldn't
escort.
depress their guns enough to hit the
Shells
tiny
passed
destroyer
overhead,
escort, or punched through the ship without
Shells
exploding,
passed overhead,
or punched through
in
the
gun
ship
mount
without
52
exploding.
after on Samuel B.
In gun mount 52
Roberts,
after on
gunner's
Samuel B.
mate.
Third class Paul
Roberts,
Henry Carr
gunner's
was
mate.
performing miracles.
Third class Paul Henry Carr.
Carr was 20
performing
years old
miracles.
from Chakakota, Oklahoma.
Carr was 20 years old from
His gun crew was
Chakakota,
firing
Oklahoma.
6 rounds per minute. His gun
Twice
crew
the
was firing
designed
6 rounds per minute. Each
Twice the
54
designed
AU
rate.
shell had to be manually
Each
loaded,
54
manually
AU
rammed.
shell
had to be manually
The
loaded,
gun was so
manually
hot
rammed.
that shells were starting to
The
cook
gun
off
was
from
so
the heat.
hot that shells were
The
starting
compressed
to cook
air
off from the
system
heat.
that cleared powder gases from
The
the breach
compressed
had
air
failed.
system that cleared powder gases
But
from
Carr's
the
crew
breach
kept
had failed.
loading, kept firing.
But Carr's crew kept
At
loading,
8:15,
kept firing.
the battle had become total chaos.
At 8:15, the battle
Rain
had become
squalls
total chaos.
and smoke had reduced visibility
Rain
to hundreds
squalls
of yards
and
in
smoke
some
had
places.
reduced visibility to hundreds
Ships
of yards
appeared
in
and
some
disappeared
places.
like ghosts.
Ships appeared.
Japanese
and
ships
disappeared
were
like
firing
ghosts.
at each other in the confusion.
Japanese ships were firing
American
at each other
destroyers
in the confusion.
were weaving between shell splashes.
American destroyers
darting
were
in to
weaving
fire their
between
5
shell
in
splashes,
guns,
then
darting in
disappearing
to fire
back
their
into the
5 in
smoke.
guns,
then disappearing
Admiral
back
Kurita
into
was
the smoke.
confused.
Admiral
His lookouts
Kurita
were
was
reporting
confused.
they were fighting fleet carriers.
His lookouts
not
were
escort
reporting
carriers.
they were fighting fleet carriers.
The silhouettes
escort
didn't
carriers.
match anything in Japanese recognition
The silhouettes
manuals.
didn't match anything in Japanese
These little
recognition
escort
manuals.
carriers, displacing 8,000
These little
tons,
escort carriers
were being reported
displacing
as 30,000
tons,
ton Essex
were
class
being
fleet
reported
carriers.
as 30,000 ton
The
Essex
destroyers
class
were
fleet
being
carriers.
reported as cruisers.
The destroyers were being
Kurita
reported
thought he had
as
stumbled
cruisers.
into a task group from
Kurita
Hulse's
thought he
third
had
fleet.
stumbled into a task group
The
from
confusion
Hulse's
was
third
compounded
fleet.
by Kurita's order for
The
general
confusion
attack.
was compounded
Instead of
by
a coordinated
Kurita's order
battle
for
line.
general attack. Instead of a
Each division
coordinated
was
battle
operating
line.
independently.
Each division was
Ships were
operating
getting in each
independently.
other's way. Ships were
The
getting in
destroyer
each other's
divisions
way.
had been ordered to the rear. The
Just
destroyer
when they should
divisions
have been
had been
pressing
ordered to the attacks, just when they should have been pressing torpedo attacks.
Meanwhile,
Tactical
the
chaos.
American pilots were attacking with everything
Meanwhile,
they had.
The American pilots were attacking
Lieutenant
with everything
Commander
they
Edward
had.
Huxtable, Air Group
Lieutenant
Out
Commander
Commander
Edward
from the
Huxtable,
escort carrier Gambia
Air Group
Bay,
Out Commander
made
from
10
the escort
attack
carrier
runs
Gambia
against
Bay.
Japanese ships
Made
without
10
any
attack
ammunition
runs
at
against
all.
Japanese ships without
He
any
would dive at a
ammunition
cruiser
all.
or battleship.
Pull
He
up
would
at the
dive at
last
a
second.
cruiser or battleship.
Circle around. Pull up
and
at
do
the
it
last
again.
second. Circle around.
When he finally
and do it
landed on the
again.
escort carrier Manila Bay,
When he finally
his
landed on
Avenger
the
had
escort
over
carrier
200
Manila
bullet
Bay,
holes in it.
his Avenger had over
But his dry
200
runs
bullet
had
holes
forced
in it.
Japanese ships to maneuver.
But his dry
throwing
runs
off
had
their
forced
aim.
Japanese ships to maneuver.
Other pilots
throwing
were
off their
strafing
aim.
battleships with 50 caliber
Other pilots
machine
were
guns,
strafing battleships
hoping to
with
damage
50
fire
caliber
control
machine
equipment.
guns, hoping to damage
Some
fire
dropped
control
100
equipment.
bombs on anti-personnel bombs.
Some
on
dropped
cruiser
100
decks.
bombs on anti-personnel
One
bombs
pilot
on
dropped a
cruiser
depth
decks.
charge on a destroyer.
One pilot dropped a
It
depth
didn't
charge
do
on a
much
destroyer,
damage,
but it added to the
It
confusion.
didn't do much damage, but
At
it added
8:30,
to the confusion.
USS Hell was finished. At 8:30,
Surrounded by
USS Hell was
Japanese
finished.
ships.
Hit over 40
Surrounded
times.
by Japanese
Engines
ships.
destroyed.
Hit over 40
Guns
times.
knocked out. Engines destroyed.
She was a
Guns
burning,
knocked
sinking
out.
wreck. She was a
Commander
burning, sinking
Kentberger gave
wreck.
the order to abandon ship.
Commander Kentberger gave the
Hell
order
rolled
to
over and
abandon
sank
ship.
at 8-5. Hell rolled
Of
over
her crew
and
of
sank at
39,
8-5.
only 86 survived.
Of her crew of 39, only 86
men
survived.
died with their ship. 253
At 8
men
foot,
died with their
Samuel
ship.
B. At 8
Roberts
foot,
took 3
Samuel
8-10
B.
shells in rapid succession.
Roberts took 3 8-10 shells
One tore a
in
hole
rapid
40
succession.
feet long in her port side at the
One
waterline.
tore a hole 40 feet long in her
Another
port side at the
destroyed what
waterline.
was left of her engine power.
Another destroyed what
The
was left
third
of
was
her
a direct
engine
hit
power.
on gunmount 52.
The third was a direct
The
hit on
explosion
gunmount
was
52.
catastrophic.
The
Most
explosion
of Gunner's
was
mate
catastrophic.
car's 10-man crew was killed
Most of
instantly.
Gunner's mate car's 10-man crew
Carr himself
killed
was ripped
instantly.
open from neck to groin.
Carr himself was ripped
His
open
internal
from neck
organs
to
were
groin.
exposed.
His internal
He was
organs
dying.
were exposed. Would be dead in
He
minutes.
was dying.
But he was still conscious. Would be dead in minutes. A
But he
repair
was still
party found him
conscious.
holding a 54
A repair
shell
party found him holding
against what
a
was left of his
54
chest,
Tualalu shell,
begging
against
someone
what
to
was
help
left
him
of
load
his
it
chest.
to fire one more
Begging
round.
someone to help him load it.
He
to
died
fire
holding
one more
that
round.
shell.
His
He died
gun mount
holding
had
that
fired
shell.
over 300 rounds in 35
His
minutes.
gun mount had fired
Most
over
of them
300
after power
rounds
was
in
lost.
35 minutes. Most of
All
them
hand
after power
loaded
was lost.
and aimed. All
The
hand
barrel
loaded
was warped
and
from the
aimed.
heat of continuous firing. The barrel was warped from the
At
heat of
9:05,
continuous firing.
Samuel B. At
Roberts was
9:05,
sinking.
Samuel B.
Lieutenant
Roberts
Commander
was
Copeland
sinking.
gave the order to abandon ship.
Lieutenant Commander Copeland gave
The
the order to
destroyer
abandon
escort
ship.
rolled over and sank at 10
The destroyer
OPAs.
escort rolled over and sank at
589.
10 OPAs. Of her
589.
1-8 man crew went down with the ship. Of her 1-8 man
Back
crew
on
went
Johnston,
down with the ship.
Commander Evans was still
Back
fighting
on
despite
Johnston,
his wounds.
Commander Evans was still
With
fighting
one
despite
engine,
his wounds.
3 guns out of action. With
And
one
steering
engine,
control lost.
3 guns out of
He had
action.
shifted command
And
to the
steering
after
control
steering
lost.
station. He had shifted command to
Men
the
were
after
manually
steering
cranking
station.
the rudder, while Evans
Men
shouted
were manually
orders through an
cranking
open
the
hatch.
rudder.
While Evans shouted
Blood
orders
from
through
his
an open
wounds had
hatch.
pulled on the deck around him.
Blood from his wounds had
At
pulled on the
8:20,
deck around him.
Johnston emerged from her smoke screen.
At 8:20,
to find
Johnston
herself facing
emerged
a
from her
Congo
smoke
class
screen.
battleship.
To
At
find herself
7,000
facing a
Brewsters.
Congo class battleship. At
Without
7,000
hesitation,
Brewsters. Evans ordered his remaining
Without
guns to
hesitation,
open fire. Evans ordered his
For
remaining
the next
guns
40
to open
minutes,
fire. The crippled destroyer
for the next
engaged
40
in a
minutes,
point-blank gun
the
duel
crippled
with the
destroyer
battleship.
engaged in a point-blank
Her
gun
5
duel
inch
with
shells
the
couldn't
battleship.
penetrate Congo's armor.
Her 5 inch
But
shells
Evans
couldn't
wasn't trying to
penetrate
sink her.
Congo's armor. But
He was
Evans
trying
wasn't
to
trying to
distract
sink
her.
her. To ruin her fire
He was
control.
trying to distract
To keep her from
to ruin
accurately
her fire
targeting the
control.
carriers. To keep her from accurately
At 9
targeting
o'clock,
the carriers.
Japanese destroyers had
At
closed
9
in on
o'clock,
Johnston. Japanese
surrounding her,
destroyers had closed
pumping
in on
shells
Johnston
into her from all
surrounding
sides.
her. Pumping shells
She had
into
no
her from
power.
all sides.
No guns still functioning.
She had no
Was flooding
power.
rapidly.
No guns still functioning.
Evans
Was
gave the
flooding
order
rapidly.
to abandon ship. Evans gave the
He was
order
last
to
seen on
abandon
the
ship.
fantail, helping wounded
He
sailors
was last
into
seen
life
on the
rafts.
fantail,
Still
helping
giving
wounded
orders
sailors
despite
into
his
life
wounds.
rafts.
Still giving
His
orders
body was
despite
never
his
found.
wounds. As
His body
Johnston
was
sank
never
at
found.
9:10, something
As
extraordinary
Johnston
happened.
sank at 9:10,
The
something
Japanese
extraordinary
destroyer
happened.
Yukikaze was
The
passing
Japanese
close by.
destroyer Yukikaze
Her captain
was passing
ordered his
close
crew
by.
to stand at attention.
Her captain
salute
ordered
the
his
sinking
crew to
American
stand
destroyer.
at attention.
And salute the
Even the
sinking
enemy
American
recognized
destroyer.
courage when they saw it. Even the enemy recognized
The escort
courage when
carrier
they saw it.
Gambia Bay was in trouble.
The escort carrier
She'd been
Gambia Bay
taking
was in
hits for
trouble.
over an hour. She'd been taking
Shells from
hits for
Yamato,
over an hour.
from Chikuma,
Shells
from
from
multiple other
Yamato,
ships, from Chikuma.
She was
from
the
multiple
rearmost
other
carrier,
ships.
the closest to the
She was the
pursuing
rearmost
Japanese.
carrier.
The closest to
An
the
8-inch
pursuing
shell from
Japanese.
Chikuma had penetrated to her
An
engine
8-inch
room.
shell from Chikuma had
She was
penetrated
losing
to her
speed,
engine room,
falling behind the others.
She was losing speed.
At
falling
9:07,
behind the others.
Gambia Bay capsized to
At
port and
9:07,
sank. Gambia Bay
She
capsized
was the
to
only
port and
American
sank.
aircraft carrier ever
She
sunk
was
by
the only
naval
American
gunfire.
aircraft carrier ever sunk by naval
131 of her
gunfire.
crew died.
But she had lasted over
131 of
2
her
hours
crew
under
died.
fire from
But
battleships.
she had lasted over 2 hours under
2
fire
hours
from battleships.
that allowed 5 other carriers to
2
escape.
hours that allowed 5
By
other
9
carriers
o'clock
to
A.
escape.
By 9 o'clock,
3 Japanese heavy cruisers were out of action. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers
Chokai was
were
burning
out of
from
action.
bomb hits,
and the pounding
Chokai
she'd taken
was burning
from
from
Samuel
bomb
B.
hits.
And the pounding she'd taken
Roberts.
from Samuel B.
Kumano was crippled from
Roberts.
Johnston's torpedo attack.
Kumano was crippled from Johnston's
Chikuma had been
torpedo
hit
attack.
by over 305 in shells.
Chikuma
from
had
the
been hit
American
by over
destroyers
305 in
and
shells
was now taking
from the
torpedo
American attacks
destroyers
from carrier aircraft.
and was now taking torpedo attacks
At
from carrier
911,
aircraft.
something unexpected happened.
At 911,
Something
Admiral Kurita
unexpected happened.
ordered his ships to cease
Admiral
fire
Kurita
and withdraw to
ordered
the
his
north.
ships to cease fire
After
and
2
withdraw
hours
to the north.
and 35 minutes of battle.
After 2 hours,
Just when
and
the
35
Japanese
minutes
seemed
on the
battle.
verge of breaking through,
Just
to
when
the
the Japanese
defenseless
seemed on the
transports at
verge of
Leyte,
breaking
breaking through
Kurita
to the
turned away.
defenseless transports at Lee.
Why?
Kurita
Historians still debated.
Why?
Kurita would
Historians
later
still
claim
debated.
he received reports of American
Kurita
carriers
would later
to the
claim
north. He received
though no
reports
such
of American
reports were
carriers
ever
to the
found in
north.
DT.
Though no
Japanese
such reports
records
were ever found in DT.
He claimed
Japanese
he was low on
records.
fuel, though his ships
He
had enough
claimed
to
he was
continue
low on fuel,
operations.
though his ships had enough
He
to
claimed he
continue
thought he'd
operations.
already sunk several fleet carriers.
He claimed he
and
thought he'd
achieved his
already
objective.
sunk several fleet carriers.
The
and
truth
achieved
was
his
probably
objective.
more complex.
The truth was
Kurita
probably
was
more
exhausted.
complex. He hadn't
Kurita
slept
was
in 3
exhausted.
days. He
His
hadn't
original
slept in 3
flagship,
days. The heavy cruiser
His
Otago
original flagship
had been torpedoed.
The heavy cruiser
and
Otago
sunk by the American
had been
submarines
torpedoed
Dart and Dace,
and sunk by
on
the
October
American
23rd.
submarines Dart and Dace.
He'd
on
been
October
forced to swim
23rd.
for his life. Was rescued.
He'd been forced to
then
swim for his
transferred
life.
to Yamato.
Was rescued.
Then
He'd lost
transferred
the
to
super
Yamato.
battleship Musashi to air
He'd
attacks
lost
on
the super
October
battleship
24th.
Musashi to air attacks
Now
on
he'd
October
lost 3 heavy
24th.
cruisers with 3 more damage.
Now he'd lost 3 heavy cruisers
More
with 3
importantly,
more damage.
Kurita had lost tactical
More
control of the
importantly,
battle.
Kurita had lost
His
tactical
forces were
control of the
scattered.
battle. Yamato's
forces were
10-minute run
scattered.
to the north had taken him out of
Yamato's
command.
10-minute run to the north had taken
Communications
him out
were
of
poor.
command.
He didn't know where
Communications
half
were
his ships
poor.
were. He didn't know where
American
half
air
his
attacks
ships
were
were.
intensifying.
American air
Every
attacks
few
were
minutes,
intensifying.
more planes appeared.
Every
Forcing
few
his
minutes,
ships to maneuver.
more planes appeared,
Disrupting their
forcing
formations.
his ships to maneuver.
And
Disrupting
there was
their
the
formations.
psychological factor. And there was
The Americans weren't
factor.
acting like a defeated force. The Americans weren't acting
Destroyers
like a defeated
don't charge
force.
battleships
unless they're
Destroyers
screaming
don't
something
charge
important.
battleships
Unless they're
Carriers
screaming
don't
something
turn
important.
toward the enemy
unless they have
Carriers
support
don't
coming.
turn toward the enemy
The
unless
sheer
they have
aggression
support
of the
coming.
American attack.
The
sheer
willingness to
aggression of
die
the
rather
American
than
attack.
run. The
created
willingness
an
to
illusion
die rather
that
than
Kurita
run.
was facing
Created
the
an
vanguard of a
illusion
larger
that
force.
Kurita was facing
not a
the
handful of
vanguard of a
escorts
larger
making the
force.
last stand.
Not a handful of escorts
At
making the
9:20
last
was
stand.
over. The
At
Japanese
9:20
were
was
withdrawing.
over.
The
Japanese
survivors
were
of Taffy
withdrawing.
3 watched the pagoda
The
masts
survivors of
disappear
Taffy
into the
3
northern
watched the
horizon,
pagoda masts
unable to
disappear
believe
into
they
the
were still
northern
alive.
horizon.
Unable to
They
believe
had
they
faced
were
a
still
force
alive.
with 10 times their firepower.
They had faced a
and
force with
somehow
10
survived.
times their firepower.
But
and
the cost had
somehow
been
survived.
terrible.
USS
cost had
Johnston
been
was
terrible.
gone with 141
USS
dead,
Johnston was
including
gone
Commander
with
Evans.
141 dead.
USS
including
Hell was
Commander
gone
Evans.
with 83 dead. USS Hell was
USS
gone with
Samuel
83
B.
dead. Roberts was
USS
gone with
Samuel
89
B.
dead. Roberts was gone
USS
with
Gambia
89
Bay
dead.
was gone with 1.
USS
dead.
Gambia Bay was gone with 1.
Hundreds more were
31
wounded.
dead. The
Hundreds
survivors
more
from
were
the
wounded.
sunken ships faced a new
The
ordeal.
survivors from the sunken ships
They would spend
faced a new
50 hours
ordeal.
in shark-infested waters.
They would
before
spend
being
50
rescued.
hours in shark-infested waters.
Many had
before
been
being
wounded in the
rescued.
battle. Many
Some
had been
died
wounded
waiting
in
for
the
rescue.
battle.
Some
Men
died
went mad
waiting
from
for
thirst
rescue.
and drank sea udder. Men went mad from
Sharks
thirst
took
and drank
others.
sea udder. The men from
Sharks
Samuel
took
B.
others.
Roberts
men
tied
from
themselves
Samuel B.
together in groups, so they
Roberts
wouldn't drift
tied
apart.
themselves together in groups.
They
so
sang
wouldn't
songs,
drift apart.
told jokes, anything
They
to
sang
keep
songs,
spirits up. Told jokes,
When
anything
rescue
to keep
finally
spirits
came,
up. Many were too weak
when
to
rescue
climb the
finally
rope
came,
ladders. Many were too weak
an
to
hour
climb
after
the
the
rope
surface
ladders.
battle ended.
The first
An hour after
kamikaze
the surface
attacks in
battle
history
ended.
struck Taffy
The first
3.
kamikaze attacks in
The
history
escort
struck
carrier
Taffy
St.
3.
Lo was hit by a Zero.
The
carrying a
escort
bomb.
carrier St. Lo was hit by
The
a Zero
explosion
carrying a
detonated
bomb.
the ship's magazine. The explosion
She
detonated
sank
the
in
ship's
30
magazine.
minutes with Wade dead.
She sank in 30
The carriers
minutes with
that had
Wade
survived
dead.
battleships couldn't
The
survive a
carriers
single
that had
determined
survived
pilot.
battleships
But
couldn't
that's
survive
another
a
story.
single determined pilot.
The Battle
But
of
that's
Samar
another
was
story.
over.
But its effects
The Battle
rippled
of
across
Samar
the
was
Pacific
over.
War. But its effects rippled
The
across
Japanese
the Pacific
combined
War.
fleet never mounted
The
another
Japanese
major
combined
offensive
fleet
operation.
never mounted another major
They had been
offensive
turned back by
operation.
ships that shouldn't have been able
They
to
had been
turn
turned
back
back by
efficient
ships
fleet,
that shouldn't have
let
been
alone
able
the
to turn
pride
back
of the
the Imperial
efficient
Navy.
fleet. Let alone the
Admiral
pride of the Imperial
Kurita
Navy.
would survive the war.
Lived
Admiral
to be
Kurita
88 years
would
old,
survive the war.
dying in
Lived to be
1977.
88 years old,
He
dying
would
in
give interviews,
1977. Write articles. He would
Try to
give
explain
interviews.
what happened off
Write
Samar.
articles. But he
Try
could
to
never
explain what
adequately
happened off
explain
Samar.
why he turned away.
But
when
he
the
could never
American
adequately
transports were
explain
within
why
his
he turned
grasp.
away when the American
The
transports
best
were
he could
within his
offer
grasp.
was that he thought he'd done enough
The
damage.
best he could
that
offer
further losses
was that he
weren't
thought
worth
he'd
it.
done enough damage. That
In a
further losses weren't worth
1953
it.
article, he would
In a
admit that the American
1953
defense was
article,
so valiant
he would
and
admit
skillful
that the American
that he
defense was
believed
so
he was facing
valiant
a
and
much
skillful
stronger force.
that he believed he was facing
The
a much
Americans
stronger
couldn't
force.
believe what they'd accomplished. The Americans couldn't believe
Admiral
what they'd
Sprague
accomplished.
would later write that the survival of his
Admiral
force
Sprague
could
would later
only be
write that the
attributed
survival
to
of
the
his
special
force
dispensation
could
of
only be
Almighty God.
attributed to the special dispensation
Admiral
of
Nimitz
Almighty
called it
God.
the finest hour of the entire
Admiral
Pacific
Nimitz
War.
called it the finest hour
Admiral
of the entire
Halsey,
Pacific War.
when he learned what had happened,
Admiral
reportedly
Halsey
wept.
when he learned what had happened.
His decision to
reportedly
chase the
wept.
Japanese decoy force, his
Had
decision
nearly
to
led
chase
to
the
disaster.
Japanese decoy force, had
Only
nearly
the
led
courage
to
of Taffy
disaster.
3 had saved the invasion.
Only the courage of Taffy 3
Commander
had saved
Ernest
the
Evans
invasion.
was awarded the Medal of Honor.
Commander
posthumously.
Ernest Evans was awarded the Medal
He
of
was
Honor
the first Native
posthumously.
American in the Navy to receive it. He was the first Native American
The
in the Navy
citation
to
reads in
receive it.
part, for
The
conspicuous
citation
gallantry
reads in part
and intrepidity,
for
at the risk
conspicuous
of his
gallantry
life,
and
above and
intrepidity,
beyond the call
at the
of
risk
duty,
of his
as
life,
commanding
above
officer
and
of
beyond the
USS
call of
Johnston,
duty,
as
in
commanding
action
officer
against
of
major
USS
units of the
Johnston,
enemy Japanese
in
fleet,
action against
during the
major
Battle of
units of the
Samar.
enemy Japanese fleet,
fleet. Without
During the
waiting for
Battle of
orders,
Samar.
Commander Evans gallantly
Without waiting
diverted
for
the
orders,
powerful blast
Commander
of hostile
Evans
guns
gallantly
from the
diverted the
lightly
powerful
armed
blast
and
of
armored
hostile
carriers
guns
under his protection.
from the lightly armed and
Launching
armored
the first
carriers under
torpedo
his
attack.
protection.
When the Johnston
Launching the
came
first
under
torpedo
straddling
attack.
Japanese shell fire.
When the
Johnston came under straddling
Lieutenant
Japanese
Commander
shell
Robert
fire.
Copeland was awarded the
Lieutenant
Navy Cross.
Commander Robert Copeland was
Gunner's
awarded
Mate.
the Navy Cross.
Third Class Paul Henry Carr.
Gunner's Mate
was awarded the
Third
Silver
Class
Star
Paul Henry
posthumously.
Carr was awarded the
In
Silver Star
1980
posthumously. The Navy commissioned
In
a guided
1980
missile frigate
the
named
Navy
USS
commissioned
Carr
a guided
missile
missile frigate
named USS
one of the few
Carr
ships
in his
ever
honor.
named for an enlisted sailor.
One of the few ships ever named
But these
for an
men
enlisted
wouldn't have
sailor.
wanted medals. But these
They
men
would have
wouldn't
said
have
they
wanted
were
medals.
just doing their jobs. They would have said they were
They
just
all would
doing
have
their
said that.
jobs. The men
They all
who
would have
charged
said that.
battleships and destroyers. The men who charged
kept loading
battleships and
guns with their
destroyers.
dying breath.
The men who kept
The men
loading
who
guns
flew
with their
unarmed
dying
planes
breath.
at enemy ships.
The men who flew unarmed
They
planes
weren't
at
trying to
enemy
be
ships.
heroes.
They were
weren't
trying to
be
protect the
heroes.
carriers, the transports.
They were trying to
the
protect
soldiers
the carriers,
on the beach,
the transports.
They were
the
doing what
soldiers
the
on the
moment
beach.
demanded, what their shipmates
They were
needed,
doing what the moment
what their
demanded,
country required,
what their shipmates needed.
The
What their
Japanese
country
had called them
required.
tin cans as an insult.
The Japanese had called them tin
These
cans
weren't
as
real
an
warships,
insult.
just cheap escorts.
These weren't real
with thin
warships,
armor and small
just
guns.
cheap escorts with thin
The
armor
Americans
and small
had embraced
guns.
the term tin can
The Americans
sailors.
had embraced the term.
They called
tin can
themselves
sailors.
with pride. They called
And those
themselves
tin
with
cans
pride.
had hearts of iron. And those tin cans
When faced
had
with
hearts
annihilation,
of iron. They didn't run.
When
They
faced with
attacked.
annihilation, they didn't
And in
run.
attacking,
They attacked. In choosing death over dishonor.
And in attacking,
they achieved
in choosing
immortality.
death over dishonor.
The
They achieved
statistics tell part
immortality.
of the story. The statistics
3
tell part
destroyers
of the story.
and 4 destroyer escorts
3
against 4
destroyers
battleships
and 4 destroyer
6 heavy
escorts
cruisers
against 4
2 light
battleships,
cruisers 6
and
heavy
11
cruisers 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers.
The Americans
11
were
destroyers.
outnumbered 3 to 1 in ships.
The
10
Americans
to
were
1 in
outnumbered
tonnage,
3 to 1 in
20
ships,
to 1 in
10
firepower.
to 1 in tonnage,
They
20
should
to
have
1
been
in firepower.
annihilated in minutes. They should have been
Instead,
annihilated in
they
minutes.
fought for 2.5 hours.
Instead,
sank 3
they
heavy
fought
cruisers,
for 2.5 hours,
damaged 3 more,
sank 3 heavy
and turned
cruisers,
back the most
damaged
powerful
3
surface
more,
force Japan
and
had
turned back
assembled
the
since
most
Midway.
powerful surface force Japan
But
had assembled
statistics
since
don't
Midway.
measure courage.
But
They
statistics
don't
don't
quantify
measure courage.
determination.
They don't
They
quantify
can't calculate the
determination.
power of men who know they're going
They
to
can't
die,
calculate
but
the power of
attack
men
anyway.
who know they're going to die.
The tin
but
cans
attack
of Taffy
anyway.
3 proved that sometimes
The tin cans of
against
Taffy
all
3
odds,
proved that
against all
sometimes,
logic,
against all
against
odds,
all reasonable
against all
expectation,
logic,
courage
against
is
all
enough.
reasonable expectation.
There's a memorial
Courage is
now at
enough.
Fort Rosecrans National
There's a
Cemetery in
memorial
San
now at
Diego.
Fort Rosecrans National
A
Cemetery
simple
in
granite
San
stone
Diego.
listing 3 ships.
A simple
USS
granite
Johnston
stone listing
USS
3 ships.
Hoel, USS
USS
Samuel B,
Johnston,
USS Hoel,
Roberts.
USS Samuel B.
Most people who pass
Roberts.
it don't know what those names mean.
Most people who pass it
don't know
what
that
those
on
names
October
mean.
25th,
1944,
don't know that on October 25th,
those ships charged into certain
1944,
death, and
those
somehow
ships
saved
charged
an army.
into certain death.
Every
and
year on
somehow saved
October
an army.
25th, a few old men
Every
used
year
to
on
gather
October
there.
25th,
A few
survivors
old men
of
used to
Taffy
gather
3.
there. They would read
Survivors
the
of
names
Taffy
of the
3.
dead, tell the old
They
stories.
would read the names of the dead,
Remember,
tell the old
there aren't
stories.
many left now.
Remember,
The
there
last
aren't many
survivor
left
of
now.
Samuel B. The last
Roberts,
survivor of
a
Samuel
dread
B.
Lenoir,
died in March
Roberts,
2022.
a dread Lenoir,
at age 97.
died in March 2022.
Time has
at
done
age
what Japanese
97.
shells couldn't. Time has done
But
what
the story
Japanese
lives
shells
on.
couldn't.
In
But the
November
story lives on.
2019, the research
In November
vessel Petrol,
2019,
funded by Microsoft
the research
co-founder
vessel
Paul
Petrol,
Allen's estate,
funded by Microsoft
found wreckage
co-founder
from
Paul
one of the
Allen's
destroyers
estate,
at 2180
found wreckage
feet.
from one of the destroyers at
Using a remotely
2180
operated
feet.
vehicle,
They captured
using a
haunting
remotely
images of
operated
gun
vehicle,
mounts. They
torpedo
captured
tubes,
haunting images
and
of
the
gun
ship's
mounts,
bell.
torpedo tubes.
In March
and the ship's
2021,
bell.
it was positively
In March
proto-identified
2021,
as USS
it was
Johnston
positively
through her hull
proto-identified
number
as
57
USS
visible
Johnston
on the wreckage.
through her hull number 57
At that
visible
time,
on the wreckage.
she was the deepest shipwreck ever
At
discovered.
that time, she was the deepest
She's broken
shipwreck
in
ever
half,
discovered,
where she was hit by 18
She's broken
shells
in
from
half,
Yamato,
where she was
split
hit by
at frame
18
130,
shells from Yamato,
where the massive
split
shell
at frame
detonated.
130, where the
Her
massive
forward
shell
section
detonated.
lies upright.
Her 5
Her
and
forward
gun mount
section
still
lies
trained
upright,
outboard,
as
her
if
5
ready
and
to
gun
engage.
mount still trained outboard.
Her
as if
bridge
ready to
structure is
engage.
gone.
Destroyed in the
Her
battle.
bridge structure is
taking
gone.
Commander Evans'
Destroyed
last
in the
stand
battle.
with it. Taking Commander
But her
Evans'
guns
last
still
stand
point
with it.
outward.
Defiant to
But
the
her
end.
guns still point
Eternal
outward.
sentinels in the
Defiant to
darkness.
the end.
Eternal
In
sentinels
June
in the
2022,
darkness. Explorer
in
Victor
June
Vesco and his
2022,
team aboard the research
Explorer
vessel
Victor
Pressure
Vesco
Drop
and his team
found
aboard the
USS
research
Samuel
vessel
B.
Pressure Drop.
Roberts
Found
at
USS
22,061 forward,
Roberts
breaking
at
Johnston's record
22,061
as the deepest
forward,
shipwreck
breaking
ever
Johnston's
found.
record as the
The
deepest
images
shipwreck
were
ever
remarkable.
found.
Her
The
guns
images
too
were
are
remarkable.
still pointed toward the enemy.
Her guns
Frozen
too
in
are
their
still
last
pointed
moments
toward
of
the
battle.
enemy.
Frozen in
The
their last
torpedo
moments of
tubes are
battle.
empty. The
There,
torpedo tubes
lethal
are
cargo
empty.
expended in that desperate
There,
charge. Lethal cargo expended
You
in
can
that
see where the
desperate
massive
charge.
hole was blown in her side.
You can see where the
where
massive
8-inch
hole
shells
was blown
tore
in her
through her
side.
engine room.
Where the 8-inch shells
But she
tore
sits
through her
upright.
engine room. Proud. Still
But she
ready
sits
to fight.
upright.
Still
Proud.
defending the carrier
Still
she
ready to
died to
fight.
protect. Still defending the carrier
The destroyer
she died to
escort
protect.
that fought like a battleship forever
The
on
destroyer
watch in the
escort
dark
that fought
Pacific
like a
depths.
battleship forever on watch in the
Finding
dark
these wrecks
Pacific
was more
depths.
than archaeology.
Finding these wrecks
For the
was more than
families of the men who
archaeology.
died,
It was
for
closure.
the families of the men who died,
They finally
it
knew
was
where their
closure.
loved ones rested. They finally knew where
For the
their loved
Navy,
ones
it
rested.
was validation of a legendary
For the
story.
Navy, it was validation
The
of
wreck
a
showed the
legendary
damage
story.
described in survivor
The
accounts.
wreck showed the
proved
damage
intensity
described
of the
in
battle.
survivor accounts. Proved
For
the
historians,
intensity of the battle.
It was confirmation of
For
details long
historians,
debated.
it was confirmation of
And for
details
all of
long
us,
debated.
It was a reminder that
And
the
for all
ocean
of
floor
us,
is a vast
it was a
cemetery
reminder
filled
that
with
the ocean
vessels
floor
and
is a
men
vast
who
cemetery
gave
filled
everything
with
for
the
their
vessels
country.
and men
who gave
USS
everything
Hell
for
has
their
never
country.
been found. USS
She
Hell
lies
has never
somewhere
been
in
found.
20,000 foot of water.
She
off
lies
Samar.
somewhere in
Her
20,000
exact
feet
location
of water
unknown.
off Samar.
But her
Her
story,
exact location
like those
unknown.
of Johnston and Roberts,
But her story
will never be forgotten.
like those of Johnston and Roberts.
Not as
will
long as
never
there
be
are
forgotten.
sailors in the United States Navy.
Not as long as there
who
are
remember
sailors
what
in the
courage
United
means.
States Navy
Who
the
remember
destroyer,
what courage
USS
means.
Herman, survived the battle.
The destroyer,
the only
USS
destroyer
Herman,
of Taffy
survived the
3 to
battle.
do so.
The only destroyer of
Despite
Taffy 3
taking
to
major
do so.
damage, she was repaired.
Despite taking
and
major
went on
damage,
to serve through the
she
rest
was
of the
repaired,
war.
and went on to serve
She earned
through
the
rest of
Presidential
war.
Unit Citation.
She earned the
Unit
Presidential
Commendation,
Unit Citation
and 5 battle
the
stars.
Navy Unit Commendation.
In
and 5 battle
1961,
stars. She was transferred
In
to Argentina
1961
and served as
she
Aura
was transferred
Almirante
to
Brown
Argentina
until
and served as
1982.
Aura Almirante Brown,
The last
until
of the tin
1982.
cans that faced down battleships.
The last of the
finally
tin
retired
cans that
after
faced
4
down
decades of
battleships.
service. Finally retired after
The
4
escort
decades
carriers
of
all
service.
survived except Gambia Bay.
The
and
escort
Saint.
carriers all survived
Low,
except Gambia
but they
Bay
bore
and
the
Saint.
scars. Low, but
Kalanan
they
Bay
bore the
took
scars.
15 hits. Kalanan Bay
White
took
planes were
15
straddled
hits.
so many times. Her
White
plates were
planes
sprung
were
from
straddled
near
so
misses.
many times. Her plates were
Fanshawe
sprung
Bay
from
had
near
shells
misses.
pass completely through her. Fanshawe Bay had shells
They were
pass
patched
completely
up,
through her.
sent back into service.
They were patched
continued
up,
operating
sent
until
back
war's
into
end.
service.
Continued operating
Ships that were
until
never meant
war's
to
end.
see combat had stood up.
Ships
to
that were
battleships
never
and
meant to
lived.
see combat had stood
Taffy
up to
3
battleships
was
and
awarded
lived.
the Presidential Unit
Taffy
Citation.
3 was awarded the
The
Presidential
citation
Unit
reads in
Citation
part
for
The
extraordinary
citation reads
heroism
in part
in action against
for extraordinary
powerful units of the
heroism
Japanese
in
fleet
action
during
against
the
powerful
Battle of
units of
Samar.
the Japanese fleet.
During
The gallant
Battle
ships
of
of
Samar.
Task Unit 7. The gallant
4.
ships of Task Unit 7.
3.
Waged
4.
battle fiercely against the
3.
superior speed and
Waged
firepower
battle
of the
fiercely against
advancing
the
enemy.
superior speed and firepower
2
of
of the unit's
advancing
valiant
enemy.
destroyers and 1
Two of the
destroyer
unit's
escort
valiant
charged the
destroyers
battleships
and
point
1
blank,
destroyer escort
and expending
charged
their
the
last
battleships
torpedoes
point
in
blank,
desperate defense
and
of the
expending
entire
their
group,
last torpedoes
went down
in
under
desperate
the
defense of
enemy's
the
heavy
entire
shells.
group.
Went down under
The
the
courageous
enemy's heavy
determination
shells.
and the superb
The
teamwork
courageous
of the officers
determination
and men
and the
who
superb
fought the
teamwork
embarked
of the
planes
officers and
who
men
manned the
who
ships
fought
of
the
Task
embarked
Unit
planes
77
and who manned the ships
4.
of Task Unit 77.
3. 4.
Here 4.
3.
3. Were
Here
instrumental in effecting the
3.
retirement of a
Were
hostile
instrumental
force,
in effecting
threatening
the
our later
retirement of a
invasion
hostile
operations,
force,
threatening
were
our
in
later
keeping with the
invasion
highest
operations,
traditions of the United
and were in
States
keeping
Naval
with the
Service.
highest traditions of the United
But that's
States
military
Naval
language.
Service.
Formal and proper. But that's military language.
The real story
Formal
is
and
simpler.
proper.
When
The real
faced with
story is
impossible
simpler.
odds, ordinary
When
sailors
faced with
became
impossible
extraordinary.
odds,
Ordinary
When
sailors
ordered to
became
buy
extraordinary.
time with their lives, they
When
bought
ordered
it.
to buy time with their lives,
When the moment
they
demanded
bought it.
heroes, they became heroes.
When the moment demanded heroes,
Not because they
became
wanted
heroes,
glory,
but because that's
not
what
because they
needed to be
wanted
done.
glory,
but because
the
that's what
Japanese
needed to be
perspective
done.
on the battle
Reveals
The
how
Japanese
completely
perspective
American
on the
attack
battle
disrupted
reveals
how
their plans.
completely the American attack
Vice
disrupted
Admiral
their
Mate
plans.
Yugaki,
Commanding
Vice
the
Admiral
battleship
Mate
division
Yugaki,
that included Yamato,
commanding the
wrote
battleship
in his
division
diary
that
the
included
spirit of
Yamato,
all-out attack
wrote in
at
his
short
diary
range was
that the
lacking
spirit
in the
of
Japanese
all-out
force.
attack
At short range was lacking
they had
in the
superior
Japanese
firepower,
force.
but couldn't coordinate.
They had superior firepower.
Captain
but couldn't
Toshio Abe
coordinate it.
of the heavy cruiser tone,
Captain
later admitted
Toshio Abe
they were
of the heavy
completely
cruiser
confused
tone
by the
later
American
admitted
tactics.
They were completely confused
We
by
thought
the
we were
American
fighting
tactics.
fleet carriers and cruisers. We thought
He
we were
said.
fighting fleet carriers and
The
cruisers.
destroyers
He
attacked
said.
so aggressively.
We
The
assumed they
destroyers
must be
attacked so
screening capital
aggressively.
ships.
We assumed they must be
The
screening
Japanese
capital
communications
ships.
during the battle showed
The
their
Japanese
confusion.
communications during the battle
Radio
showed their
intercepts
confusion.
revealed Japanese lookouts.
Radio
reporting they
intercepts
were
revealed
engaging Task
Japanese
Force
lookouts
38,
reporting they
Ho's
were
main
engaging
carrier
Task
force.
Force 38.
They
Ho's main
reported
carrier
sinking
force.
Essex-class carriers.
They
Baltimore
reported
class
sinking
cruisers.
Essex-class carriers.
They couldn't
Baltimore-class
comprehend that
cruisers.
these tiny ships would
They
attack
couldn't
so
comprehend
ferociously
that these tiny
unless
ships
they were
would attack
protecting
so
something vital.
ferociously unless they
The
were
aggression
protecting
itself
something
became
vital,
a weapon.
creating
The
an
aggression
illusion of
itself
strength
became
that
a
didn't
weapon.
exist, creating an illusion of
Vice
strength that
Admiral
didn't
Kurita's
exist.
chief of staff,
Rear
Vice Admiral
Tommy
Kurita's
G.
chief of staff,
Koyanagi Rear
later
Admiral
wrote that the
Tommy
American
G.
destroyer
Koyanagi
attacks were so
later
determined,
wrote that the American
impressed home
destroyer
so
attacks
vigorously
were so
that they
determined,
created an
impressed
impression
home
of
so
a much
vigorously
larger force.
that they created an impression
The
of a
smoke
much
screens,
larger force.
the constant air attacks,
The smoke
the
screens,
torpedoes
the
coming from
constant
multiple
air attacks,
directions.
the
It all
torpedoes
combined
coming
to
from
create
multiple
chaos
directions.
in the Japanese
It
command
all
structure.
combined to create chaos in the
No
Japanese
heed was
command
taken of
structure.
order or coordination. No heed was
Koyanagi
taken of
admitted.
order or coordination.
Each unit
Koyanagi
operated
admitted.
independently, which dispersed
Each unit
our overwhelming
operated
advantage,
independently,
and
which
Koyanagi
dispersed
our
our
overwhelming advantage. In
The
Koyanagi
Japanese
of
also
firepower.
suffered from a critical intelligence
The Japanese
failure.
also suffered from a
Their
critical
recognition
intelligence
manuals
failure.
didn't include the Casablanca
Their
class
recognition
escort
manuals
carriers.
didn't include the Casablanca
These
class
were new
escort
ships
carriers.
mass reduced in American shipyards.
These were new ships
Something the
mass
Japanese
reduced in
couldn't
American
conceive of.
shipyards. Something the
How could the
Japanese couldn't
Americans
conceive
build
of.
carriers so quickly?
How could
They
the
must be
Americans
fleet
build
carriers
so
The
quickly?
Japanese
They
officers
must be
reasoned.
fleet carriers.
The
No
Japanese
Navy would
officers
defend
reasoned.
8,000-ton merchant
No
conversion
Navy would
so
defend
desperately.
8,000-ton merchant
The
conversion
very
so
desperation of
desperately.
the American defense,
The
convinced
very
the
desperation
Japanese
of the
they were
American
facing
defense
something
convinced
important.
the Japanese.
They were
There was
facing
also the
something
human
important.
factor. There was
Admiral
also the
Kurita
human
had
factor.
been
at sea for 5 days. Admiral Kurita had been swimming for his life when American submarines sank his flagship. He'd been swimming for his life when American submarines sank his flagship. He'd watched the super battleship Musashi, pride of the Imperial Navy, sink under American pride of the Imperial Navy, sink under American air attacks, lost ships, lost confidence. He'd lost sleep, lost ships. When faced with an enemy that wouldn't retreat, that kept attacking despite overwhelming odds, that kept attacking despite overwhelming odds.
The Americans were supposed to run. The Americans
They always
were
ran
supposed
from
to run.
superior forces. They always ran
But
from
these
superior
Americans
forces.
attacked.
It didn't make sense unless they knew something. It didn't make sense unless they knew something.
Unless help was coming. He didn't.
Unless
help was coming.
After
Unless
the battle,
this was a trap.
Japanese naval officers would study what went wrong. Japanese naval officers
How
would
could the
study
most
what
powerful
went wrong.
surface force Japan
How
had
could the
assembled
most powerful
be turned
surface
back by a
force
handful
Japan
of escorts
had assembled?
The
be
official
turned
reports
back by a
blame
handful
poor
of
communications.
escorts. The official
Lack of
reports
coordination,
blame poor communications,
mechanical failures.
lack of coordination,
But privately,
mechanical failures. Many Japanese officers admitted
privately,
the truth. Many Japanese
they had
officers
been
admitted the
psychologically
truth.
defeated.
They had been
The American
psychologically
willingness to
defeated.
die rather than retreat.
The
had
American
shaken them.
willingness to die rather than
As
retreat
one
had
Japanese
shaken
destroyer
them.
captain later said.
As one
We had the
Japanese
guns,
destroyer captain
but
later
they had
said.
the spirit. We had the guns.
In war,
But they had the spirit.
sometimes spirit is enough.
In war,
The
sometimes
aftermath
spirit
of
is
the battle
enough.
rippled through both navies.
The aftermath of the battle
For the
rippled
Americans,
through both navies.
it became a legend.
For
A
the
touchstone
Americans,
of naval courage.
it became a legend.
A
The
touchstone
Naval
of
Academy
naval
started
courage.
teaching it as an example
The
of what
Naval Academy
determination
started
could
teaching it
accomplish.
as an example of what
Destroyer
determination
School
could accomplish.
used it to show young officers
Destroyer
that
School
aggressive
used
action
it to
could
show young
overcome
officers
superior forces.
that aggressive action could
The
overcome
Tenon
superior
sailors
forces.
became heroes, not just for
The
what they
Tenon
did,
sailors
but for
became
what they
heroes,
represented.
not just for what they did.
The
but for
idea
what they
that ordinary
represented.
sailors could rise to
The
extraordinary
idea
heights
that ordinary
when the moment
sailors could
demanded
rise
it.
to extraordinary heights
For years
when the
after
moment
the war,
demanded it.
the survivors would gather.
For years after the war,
They would
the
meet in
survivors
San
would
Diego,
gather.
in Houston.
They would
in
meet
Washington,
in San Diego, in Houston.
They would remember
in Washington.
shipmates who didn't make it home.
They would remember shipmates
They would
who
argue
didn't
about
make it home.
details.
They would
Who
argue
fired
about
first?
details.
Which torpedo hit which ship?
Who fired
When
first?
exactly did
Which
Kurita
torpedo
turn
hit
away?
which ship?
But they all
When
agreed
exactly
on the
did
important
Kurita turn
things.
away?
But they all
They
agreed
had
on
done
the
their
important
duty.
things. They had
They had done
protected
their
the
duty.
carriers.
They
They
had
had
protected
saved
the
the
invasion.
carriers.
And
They
they
had
had
done
saved
it,
the invasion.
not because they were special,
And they
but
had done
because
it,
that's
not
what needed
because
to
they
be
were
done.
special,
But because
Robert
that's what
Copeland,
needed to be done.
who survived the battle.
Robert
spent
Copeland,
years speaking at
who
naval
survived
events.
the battle, spent years
He would
speaking
always
at naval
emphasize
events.
that the heroes were the men who
He would
didn't
always
come back.
emphasize that the heroes were
Paul
the men
Carr
who didn't
loading
come back.
shells with his dying breath.
Paul Carr loading shells
Ernest
with
Evans
his dying
bleeding on his
breath.
bridge, but still fighting.
Ernest Evans bleeding on his
The
bridge,
nameless
but
sailors
still
who
fighting.
stayed at their posts as their
The
ship
nameless
sank.
sailors who stayed at their posts
They were the
as
real
their ship
heroes,
sank.
Copeland would say. They were the real heroes.
The rest of us
Copeland
just
would
did
say.
our jobs. The rest of
The
us
battle
just did
also
our
changed
jobs.
naval doctrine.
The battle also
It proved
changed
that
naval
aggressive
doctrine.
action by smaller forces
It proved
could
that
disrupt
aggressive
larger ones.
action by smaller forces
It
could
showed the
disrupt
importance
larger
of
ones.
initiative at the tactical level.
It showed the importance of initiative.
It demonstrated
at the
that
tactical level.
technology and firepower weren't
It demonstrated
everything.
that technology and firepower
That human
weren't
factors
everything.
like courage, determination,
That human
and
factors
leadership
like
could be
courage,
decisive.
determination, and leadership
Military
could be
colleges around the
decisive.
world still study it as
Military
an example
colleges
of
around the
asymmetric
world
warfare.
still study it as an example
How
of
a weaker
asymmetric
force can
warfare.
defeat a stronger one through
How a
superior
weaker
tactics
force
and
can
will.
defeat a stronger one through
The
superior
Battle of
tactics
Samar
and will.
also highlighted the importance
The
of air
Battle of
power.
Samar also highlighted
Even
the
though the
importance of air
escort carriers
power.
planes weren't properly armed
Even
for
though
ship
the escort
attack,
carriers planes
their
weren't
constant
properly
harassment
armed for ship
helped
attack.
drive off the
Their
Japanese
constant
fleet.
harassment helped drive
It showed
off the
that
Japanese
carriers,
fleet, even small ones.
It
had
showed
become
that
the dominant
carriers,
force in
even
naval
small
warfare.
ones,
Had become the dominant
After
force
Samar,
in naval warfare.
no one could argue that battleships
After
still ruled
Samar,
the seas.
no one could argue that battleships
The age of
still
the
ruled
carrier
the seas.
had truly arrived.
The age of the carrier
Years
had
later,
truly arrived.
a Japanese officer who
Years
survived
later,
the battle,
a
was
Japanese
asked about
officer
the American
who survived the
destroyers.
battle was asked about
shook
the
his head
American
and wondered.
destroyers.
They
He
fought
shook
like
his head and
battleships,
wondered.
he said. They fought like
We
battleships.
couldn't believe
he
such
said.
small ships would attack us.
We couldn't believe such small
They came
ships
through
would
their
attack
own
us.
smoke, firing everything
They came
had.
through their own smoke,
They
firing
wouldn't
everything
stop.
they had.
Even when we
They
had them
wouldn't
surrounded,
stop.
they kept fighting.
Even when we had them surrounded,
We had to
they
respect
kept
such
fighting.
courage.
We
In
had to
all my
respect
years
such
in the
courage.
Imperial Navy, I
In
never
all
saw
my
anything
years in
like
the
it.
Imperial Navy, I
That's
never
the
saw
real
anything
lesson
like
of
it.
the Battle of Samar. That's the real lesson
Not
of
that
the
David
Battle
can
of
beat
Samar.
Goliath, though sometimes
Not
he
that
can.
David can beat Goliath.
Not that
though
courage
sometimes
can
he
overcome
can.
overwhelming odds.
Not
Though
that courage
sometimes
can
it does.
overcome overwhelming odds.
The
Though
lesson
sometimes
is
it
that
does.
ordinary people faced with
The lesson
extraordinary
is that
circumstances
ordinary people
can choose
faced
to
with
be heroes.
extraordinary circumstances
Can choose to
be
charge when
heroes.
retreat makes sense.
Can choose to charge
Can
when
choose
retreat
to
makes
die on their
sense.
feet rather than live on
Can
their
choose to
knees.
die on their feet
The
rather than
Japanese
live on
had
their
every
knees.
advantage except one.
The Japanese had every
They were fighting
advantage
Americans
except
who
one.
wouldn't quit. They were fighting
Tin can
Americans
sailors
who
who
knew
quit.
they were going to die and
Tin
attack
can
anyway.
sailors who knew they were going to die
Men like
and
Paul
attack
Carr,
anyway, who kept firing after
Men
he
like
should have
Paul
been dead.
Carr,
Who kept firing
Men
after
like
he
Ernest
should have been
Evans,
dead. Who turned a destroyer
Men
into
like
a
Ernest
battleship
Evans,
through sheer will.
who turned a destroyer into a
Men
battleship
like Robert
through sheer
Copeland,
will.
who told his crew the
Men
truth,
like Robert Copeland,
and then led them
who
into
told
legend.
his crew the truth.
And
Men
then
like
led them
Amos
into legend.
Hathaway,
Who charged 4
Men like
battleships
Amos
with one
Hathaway,
destroyer, who
and
charged
forced
4
the mighty
battleships
Yamato
with
to
one
run.
destroyer, and forced the
In
mighty
the end,
Yamato to
that
run.
made all the difference.
In the end, 3
That
destroyers
made all the difference.
and 4 destroyer escorts,
3 destroyers
against the pride of
and
the
4
Imperial
destroyer
Japanese
escorts
Navy, against the
The
pride
tin
of the
cans
Imperial
won.
Japanese Navy.
If you
The
found tin
this story
cans
as compelling as we did,
If you found
please
this
take a
story
moment
as
to like
compelling
this
as we
video.
did, please take
These
a moment to
forgotten
like this
heroes
video.
deserve to be remembered. These forgotten heroes
Subscribe
deserve
to hear
be
more
remembered.
untold stories from World War II.
Subscribe to hear more untold
Each
stories
one
from
matters.
World War II.
Each one teaches
one
us something
matters.
about courage. About
Each one
sacrifice.
teaches us something about
what
courage,
ordinary people
about
can do
sacrifice,
when history demands
about what
heroes.
ordinary people can do when
Leave a
history
comment
demands heroes.
telling us where you're watching from.
Leave a comment
Telling
from
us
Manila
where you're
to
watching
Memphis,
from Tokyo
from
to
Manila
Toronto,
to Memphis,
from Sydney
from
to San
Tokyo
Diego
to Toronto.
We're united
from
in
Sydney
remembering
to San
those
Diego.
who gave everything
We're
when
united
everything was
in
at
remembering
stake.
those who gave everything
Thank
when
you for
everything was at
watching.
stake. If you want
Thank
to
you for
continue
watching.
discovering the quieter but
If
powerful
you want to
stories
continue
behind
discovering
World
the
War
quieter
II,
but powerful
consider
stories
subscribing
behind
to
World
Silent
War II.
Horco.
Consider subscribing
Every
to Silent
subscription
Horco.
helps us bring more depth. And
Every
perspective
subscription
to these
helps us
historical
bring more
events.
depth and perspective to
Share
these
your thoughts in
historical
the
events.
comments.
And tell me which
Share
moment
your
or
thoughts
story
in the
you would like
comments.
to explore
And
next.
tell me which moment or story you
Your
would like to
feedback
explore
shapes the
next.
direction of future videos.
Your feedback shapes the direction of future